So yeah, this is going to be a slightly different talk from what I read the other talk was about. I want to start kind of where I started out with technology. This was many, many years ago, and my first computer was an IBM XT. Now, this is decidedly not me. I asked my parents last night, do we have any photos of me with a computer? Come on, I mean, I spent most of my time in front of it. And they looked, and they live in Cyprus in the north, and they couldn't find any. So this is some kid who grew up in Hawaii, but this was kind of me, basically, right? Had this IBM XT computer, and I remember it ran something called MS-DOS. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that, but it was the kind of thing that came on these things, floppy disks. And they were actually floppy. Sometimes you had to like put your finger in them and turn them around to make them work. And I remember that, I wanted a Sinclair Spectrum or a Commodore 64 because they all had lots of games, or maybe even an Amiga. But my dad brought home this computer, and it had a couple of games. It had very simple games like Alley Cat and Digger, I think this was called. I spent a lot of time playing these, and King's Quest. I don't know if anyone remembers King's Quest. You fall into the moat and you die. It was good. But also, and this is really importantly, it didn't have a lot of games, but it did come with BASIC, which was a programming language. GW Basic and then Q Basic, which actually had an integrated development environment for the first time. And I remember my dad brought home this computer, and it had a BASIC manual with it. And he said one of the most important things that he's probably ever said to me. He said, here, play with it. You can't break it. I did. I broke it many years later. I put a coprocessor into it that wasn't meant to be put in there. And my dad had said, don't put it in here. It's not for this computer. I bought the wrong one. And when he was gone, I opened it up and I was like, let's see if it fits. If it fits, it should be okay. Voltage, whatever. And I turned it on and whew, it exploded. Literally smoke and stuff. And worst part of that story is that I made my dad believe that it was his fault. I was a kid. I was scared. So he had dropped a pin into it a week or two before when we were working with it. He dropped a pin into it. And I said, Dad, I don't know what happened, but you remember that pin you dropped into it? It must have short-circuited something. And I got a new computer. So that was... I told him many years later what happened. It was lots of fun for me. So it came with BASIC. So I learned BASIC. And it's amazing, when you're 7 years old, you have a computer, and suddenly you have a means of, with this, going into a graphics screen, creating stars, which are just little pixels, maybe creating a little spaceship, animating the spaceship, and suddenly you're flying through a universe that you've created. Now that's magical. That's the sort of thing that really empowers you if you're a kid, to make you believe that you can do anything. If you can build a spaceship and fly through the universe when you're 7, you can do anything, right? So it was BASIC and then Pascal. Whatever books my dad would bring home, I would read. So I learned C and then Turbo C, of course. It was Turbo Pascal, Turbo C. We were very much into speed even back then. Even computers had turbo buttons on them that you'd press, and it would make the clock speed faster. And of course, you always kept it pressed in, because who doesn't want to be in turbo mode, right? And it was all about, and back then, though, we were living in a very different era. I call it the age of features, because every time there was a clock speed increase, every time there was a memory increase. I mean, my first computer had a 20 megabyte hard drive, which was amazing at the time. It had a hard drive, and it was 20 megabytes. You're never going to fill that up, right? Every time you got an increase, it opened up new doors as to things that you could do that you couldn't previously do. The features were what was important back then. If it was faster, it meant you could do things that were impossible before. And so we went through this age of features for a while. And this, I think, also explains a lot about our thirst for faster, bigger, better all the time, right? But even right now, I'm running ahead of myself here, because this is where I came into it with personal computers. This is not where it began. It began a little while ago before I started using computers, with mainframes, where computers filled up entire rooms. And you had to program them using these punched cards. And what, if you want to put everything into context, today we carry things, in our pockets that are about the size of those punched cards, really, maybe about 10 of them, and they have more processing power and RAM than those computers that filled up entire rooms. So that's how far we've come. But let's put this into context. So these were mainframe computers, and they were centralized. So large businesses, universities had these mainframe computers. And you had to go and you had to actually rent out time to be able to use them via terminals. They were centralized. And these businesses and these universities owned these computers. Now, what was amazing about the time when I was born, in fact, the very year, 1976, was the birth of the Apple and the personal computer. And with PCs, we witnessed something that we haven't yet witnessed again, and that was decentralization. And this is really important. These PCs, your Apple, your IBM XT, your Commodore 64, a business didn't own it. A university didn't own it. You owned it. It didn't work for businesses, it didn't work for universities or any other organizations or the government. It worked for you, right? It was just meant as a tool for you. That's the last time we've had that. Now, since then, we've had a lot of things happen, right? We had the rise of the internet and the web, the World Wide Web, very, very big. But we've gone back, in a way, from a decentralized world to a centralized one with the web. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, you got that wrong, Aral. The web is decentralized. We all know that it's decentralized. When Tim started it off, he wanted to build this decentralized world where everyone had universal access to information and everyone would be reading and writing. The web was meant to be read-write, not just read. So you're wrong. Well, no, that was the philosophy. The architecture was very different. The architecture was client and server. Now, if you think of server, think mainframe. Think of client, the clients that we have connected to a mainframe. And in the beginning, we had a lot of people who had servers. A lot of people had their own little mainframes, right, that they were running their websites from. And we thought, because of this, that it was decentralized. We kind of fooled ourselves into we wanted it to be that way. But it wasn't. And what happened? Well, capitalism, venture capital. If you incentivize scale, if you incentivize growth, then what's going to happen to those individual nodes that are the centers, the websites? They're going to grow, right? They're going to scale vertically. They're going to coalesce. They're going to become bigger entities, bigger sites. And hence, today we have the Googles and the Facebooks and the Microsofts and the Snapchats, etc. They've each become their own kind of monopolies in a centralized way, right? Just like the mainframes. So what really interests me now, though, is where we're going to go next. We're already on that path. And it's kind of like a pendulum. It swings from centralized to decentralized to centralized. And the next swing of the pendulum is going to be decentralized. But what's that going to be? That's what really interests me right now. Because if we look at where we are today, everything that we use, from our smart televisions to the watches that we wear, to the cars that drive us to places, all of these work in the same way. They collect data, information about us. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. This is actually the way modern technology works. This is a fact of life. We're not going to change this. It would be futile to try and change this. But there is a very important question at the heart of all of this, in terms of why we do what we do and the effects that it has on society, which is, who owns and controls this data? That's a very, very, very important question. Is she okay? You all right? Yeah? It's like the TV's talking to me. It's amazing. So who owns and controls this data? Now, if the answer to that, if we can say it's us, you and me, each one of us individually, then there's no problem here. We have a democracy. We have a world where technology works to empower each one of us, just like it did when I got my first computer when I was 7. Now, if, however, we say, no, This data is owned and controlled by corporations, and by extension is made available to governments, then we're talking about a very different world to the one that I was born into. We're talking about a very different world to a decentralized one. We're talking about a centralized one. We're talking about a corporatocracy, rule of corporations, where large corporations know everything about us, and by extension, governments know everything about us, because they get their information largely from these organizations en masse, and we know nothing about them. So this is just a basic power relationship. If I know everything about you and you know nothing about me, I have power over you. Very simple. If I'm also very wealthy, then I have a lot of power and control in this sort of a society. So this is not a decision we need to make. We made this decision a couple of decades ago. Today, we are here. All of our data is owned and controlled by corporations. So we are living in a corporatocracy. You've all probably seen The Matrix, right? The Matrix got close. They just got it entirely backwards. So in The Matrix, people live in a virtual world while being farmed from a tangible world, right? So they're living in a virtual world, but they're being farmed. Their bodies are being farmed. We today, not tomorrow, we're not getting there, we're there. Today, we live in the opposite of the Matrix, in, if you will, the Matrix inverted, where we live in a tangible world, but we are increasingly being farmed from a virtual world. If you think about it, we call them server farms. Have you ever asked yourselves what it is that they are farming? Because if you do, and if you do think about it, and this is where it is so important that we do slow down, that we're not just chasing the next iteration of the next technology that comes out. Where we do slow down and we say, well, why is this happening in the direction that it's going? What does it mean? Because if you do, you might reach the conclusion that it's us. That's what they're farming. We are what they're farming. And you might say, well, is this an exaggeration? How do you know, right? Well, I run a tiny little social enterprise just across the corridor from here called Indie. And this is what I've been spending the last 6 to 8 months so far, maybe 9 months now, looking at as part of a product that we have called Better, which stops them from doing this, from farming us, at least on the web. And in order to do that, we have to find how they're farming us, so how they're tracking us, how they're tracking our behavior, how they are getting all this information about us. And so I have various scripts that go through the most popular websites and find all of the trackers that are on there automatically. And then we rate them, we rank them based on how popular they are, and we target the most popular ones, the ones that are affecting the most people, and we block them in what we're doing. So, for example, last month, we had our Cloud of Shame, which is the worst site that we could find, and it was called LifeBuzz. And this one site, this one website, if you go on to this one website, you get exposed to 172 trackers, behavioral trackers, 172 other companies that are watching you and finding out about what you're doing, right? From one site. This is the worst we could find, but 30, 40 is average, right? 30, 40 different trackers on a site. So you might say, okay, well, this doesn't sound great. I mean, does anyone think this sounds great? No, doesn't sound great. But what are the ramifications, really? Are there any real ramifications to this? What does it mean? Well, for one thing, it means that your experience is being impacted at the very surface-stantial level, right? Because if you look at it, when we block those 172 trackers, the site becomes 4 times lighter. So we save about 2.5 megabytes every time the site loads. And it becomes about 16 times faster to load. Not the moment until you see something for the first time, but the complete load of the site, which means that while it's still loading, your battery is working, your energy is being drained, right, from your phone. So we save 2 minutes of load time every time it loads on this site, just by blocking their trackers. But I wanted to go further. I wanted to see what kind of ramifications this has in the real world. So it's very easy to do that because the business of these sites, you're not their customer, of course. You are the product they sell to their customers. So they need to tell their real customers, the advertisers, how successful they are. So they have their own statistics. So it says over 250 million page views. That site gets 250 million page views a month. Wow, staggering. And then it breaks it down to statistics. 87% are from the United States, etc. So just by using their own statistics and knowing, for example, how much 1 gigabyte of data, mobile data on average costs in the United States, we were able to calculate, for example, this statistic, that this one site costs mobile phone users in the United States over $4 million a month in data charges just to load its trackers. So you want to know about like costs, actual costs? One site, $4 million a month just for US mobile phone users. That's how much they're paying to be tracked. That's just mobile phone users in the US. So this month's cloud of shame is Forbes. Have you heard of Forbes? Forbes.com? Have you ever been to Forbes.com? Beautiful experience, isn't it? The moment you get in, you get a door slam. I call these door slams, right? It's like somebody opens a door to their house as you come in, they slam it right in your face. And this door slam shows you an ad. That's why they're slamming the door in your face, to show you the ad, make sure you look at it. They're trying to, soften the blow with a quote. Business people love this sort of shit, apparently. And then they have a little continue to site button. But here's the thing, tiny little detail. This doesn't appear right away. There's a 3-second wait because they want you to see the ad, right? 3-second wait. So we said, okay, and there's about a second or so for it to load, and maybe a second if you have lightning fast reflexes for you to actually hit the button. Let's say, conservatively, it takes you 5 seconds to get past this. And they use a cookie to make sure that they only show it to you once a day, right? So they put a 24-hour cookie to make sure it only shows, so they don't really piss you off. They just want to piss you off enough so you'll come back. So they put a cookie for that. So we also said, let's be very conservative, right? And assume that you only go there once a month. So we looked at their statistics again initially, and they have about 37 trackers, etc. That's fine. But it was really this door slam that stood out. So we calculated it. We said, okay, what if it's just 5 seconds for the number of people they have? Because again, they have their statistics, like they have 46,000 people, right? And we calculated that every month, humanity loses 7.3 years of human life because of that one door slam on one site. This means that every year, basically, one lifetime in a very well-off rich country is lost to one door slam on one site. So this business that we've created around technology in general, mainstream technology, has costs, real costs. These are just some of them. But of course, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit because you can just skip this. And here's how you skip it, right? The way to skip it is you pretend that you are the Google bot. If you change the user agent of your browser to declare itself as Google, if your web browser says, hey, I'm Google, they don't make Google wait 5 seconds or 3 seconds. That's just for human beings. Robots go straight to the content. And you might be wondering, why are they doing this? I mean, this is a journalism site, right? This is supposed to be a journalism site. And our whole spotlight this month was on journalism, looking at journalism, whether or not we still have a free press, or has the business changed? Has the business of the free press changed? And you don't need to go further than, asking the publishers themselves to find this out. So Axel Springer is one of the biggest publishers in Europe. They're German. And they were in a lawsuit recently, and one of their lawyers actually said this. The core business of the publisher, the plaintiff, is to deliver ads to its visitors. This is one of the biggest publishers in Europe. Their core business is not publishing. And we have to understand this. Their core business is to deliver ads to its users, to its visitors. Now, this is the best bit. Journalistic content is just a vehicle to get visitors to view the ads. This is really important because what they're basically saying is that the free press journalism today is nothing more than bait. Now, what does that mean for our societies? Because I believe, unless I'm mistaken, that functional democracies do require a free press as part of the institution. So it doesn't have to be this way. This is the way it is, but it doesn't have to be this way. It is this way because we're fascinated with this centralized means of creating technology, the cloud, the web, the cloud by any other name, right? Of course, what we fail to see a lot of times is there is no cloud. As the Free Software Foundation says, there are only other people's computers. Whenever you hear cloud, and you will hear it a sickeningly number of times, I'm sure if you work in technology, just think they're talking about someone else's computer that will have our information on it, that will know about us, etc. And see how comfortable you feel with that. So I said earlier that what really interests me is where we can move from here. And that is really the move from a centralized world to a decentralized world, from the web to what comes next. So for example, and this is not a very complex thing, really, conceptually. So today we live in a world where Facebook says, hey, do you want to share your photo with your friend? Sure. Share it with me first. Let me scan it, let me analyze it, let me face detect, let me find out who else is in there, let me try and get emotions from your faces, let me try and see if you like this person, hate this person from this photo. Let me keep all of this information with all of the other information I have about you, and then see how I can monetize that and monetize you, and then I'll let you share it with your friend. This is technology today, right? In a nutshell. To a world where we can say, that's not necessary. If you want to share your photo with your friend, please go ahead and share your photo with your friend, which is a decentralized, peer-to-peer way of doing things. So how do we get from there to there? Well, we have to start with respect, really. It all comes down to respect or a lack of respect. Where we fail today is we do not respect human rights in what we're doing. We do not see humans as humans in the technology world. We see them as users. There are only two industries that use this term, user. One is us, and the other are drug dealers. And the analogy doesn't stop there. One of the most famous books in Silicon Valley, right now one of the most successful ones, is by Aral. You might have heard his name. And it's called Hooked. The subtitle is How to Create Addictive Experiences. Addiction, users, the other. We've already created the other. So we have to go back, and we have to actually start with a core of respecting human rights in the technologies that we build. Building things for people, not on the backs of people, which is what we're doing. And then we can go further. We can respect human effort. Respecting human rights will get us some part of the distance there. But we have to really concentrate on making things simple to use for people. And then we can go further. We can respect human experience. And if the things that we build are a cross-section of this, then we will be building that other world that I'm talking about. So it's really important for us to understand that these things that we build matter. Marshall McLuhan says, we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. Our tools have already shaped us. Today we are not merely human, and we haven't been for a very long time. We are cyborgs. I'm pretty sure none of you has embedded a microchip inside of them right now, but you don't have to. We extend our biological capabilities using technology. We are therefore cyborgs. And if we're cyborgs, we have to understand what that means, because this is key to our rights as cyborgs. When I have an idea in my brain, and I have a phone, and I use my notes application, what I'm doing is I am expanding my mind to that phone, extending my mind, extending myself. If that's the case, then we have to extend the boundaries of the self to include the technologies by which we extend ourselves. Now, if we do that, then we can put the dominant business model of technology today into context. When we have surveillance, whether it's corporate surveillance, the business model of Google, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, etc., WhatsApp, most of those are now owned by Facebook, so it's very redundant, but you know what I mean. When there's surveillance, then that becomes an assault on the self. We're no longer talking about traditional surveillance, which was signals capture between two or more actors. We're talking about an assault on the self. And that's very important because we know how to protect the self. We have a system of rights and laws and courts that we have built over many, many years, and we know how to protect the self. We know what human rights are. We just have to realize that human rights today are cyborg rights. And we have to understand that our data in this equation is us. Data about you is you. If I have a tiny figurine and I have enough data about this figurine, I can take a 3D printer and I can create a replica of this figurine. Now imagine what I can do if I have enough data about you. Hint, I don't want to 3D print you. But I do want to simulate you. That's what a profile is. The business model of mainstream technology is to track and profile you. These profiles are not things that we keep in folders, like manila folders, like in the good old days of the Stasi. They were amateurs, right? These are kept as living beings. Our algorithms constantly are psychoanalyzing your profile. Our algorithms are constantly trying to find out more about you and to understand you better. And all of that value, that insight that we're gaining, that's not for your benefit. That's for our benefit as the corporations, and then to share with the governments that want it from us. That's really important for us to understand. The data about a thing, if you have enough of it, becomes the thing. So data is not an asset. Data is not the new oil. You'll hear all of these, frankly, quite disgusting and disturbing terms when you understand what data about people is. Because data about people is people. So what are we talking about when we're talking about a business that trades in people? We've done this before, right? We did it in a very low-tech way. We traded people's bodies, and we still do it in some places. We call that slavery. So let's ask ourselves what we call our business in mainstream technology today. Because what we're doing is we're selling everything and trading in everything else about a person that makes them who they are, apart from their physical flesh. We don't need that anymore. It takes up space. Can't be easily cloned. Bothersome. I called it, last month in The New Scientist, people farming. That's, at an essence, what it is. We are farming people. Google and Facebook are factory farms for human beings. Shoshana Zuboff from MIT, I think she's Harvard actually, calls it surveillance capitalism. And these two things are related. So what's surveillance capitalism? We all know what capitalism is, right? The accrual of wealth. What happens if you add to the accrual of wealth the accrual of information? And what happens if there's a feedback loop between these things? The rich get richer, the more powerful get more powerful. Today we live in a world where, according to Oxfam, the charity in the UK that combats poverty, 62 individuals have as much wealth as half of the world's poorest population combined. We live in a world where 62 people have as much wealth as 3.5 billion people. That, in a nutshell, is a world of surveillance capitalism. So the business model of technology in such a world is people farming. And this is toxic to our rights as individuals. This is toxic to democracy if we want to reclaim it. So you have a decision to make. There's value in learning the way things are, and we do that a lot. And that's where we all start. When I started 7 years ago with my computer, I was learning the way things are. I wasn't critically analyzing it. I was awed by it. I was lucky that the way things are was a decentralized world. Not a world, but technology. Maybe the world wasn't decentralized back then. But at least our technology was, and I was lucky. But at some point, you have to really stop and ask yourself, am I happy individually with the way things are? Now, you can go a couple of ways, and this is where privilege comes into it. You might say, look, I see that the way things are, it's pretty messed up, but I'm doing okay. Let's not rock the boat. Right? That's one way. This is how privilege perpetuates itself. Or you could say, hey, the way things are, not great. I'm benefiting from it, but I'm not comfortable with that. And then maybe you do something to change it. Maybe you use the privilege that you have to try and create a world where you would not have had that privilege to begin with, because you think that maybe that will be a better world for both yourself and for other people. Because maybe you understand that the kind of world that we're building, with the amount of inequality that we're building, and technology is playing a huge amplification role in that. That's what it does, it amplifies. Maybe that's not a sustainable world. And maybe even if I am benefiting from it, my children are not going to benefit from it. So if you do decide that, and of course there are people who are just being fucked over by the system, who may not even have agency. And maybe they do. Maybe for them it's an easier decision to make. But then, if you do decide that you're unhappy with it, then there's a lot of hope. Because the way things are is just the raw material for the way things can be. And this is really important. What you can't do, by definition, is you can't stay neutral in this. And I know we're in Sweden. You guys love that concept. That concept, I am afraid, is absolute bullshit. As Desmond Tutu says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. Neutrality does not exist. If you would rather not pick, you have picked. And this is important for all of us to know. So coming back to this, how do we get to this decentralized world, this sustainable world that I want to live in? So I thought, I give similar talks about this subject, and they're always quite, higher conceptual, because I always used to think people will just make the connections afterwards. And maybe those connections are not always as easy to make. So let's make some just very basic connections. Let's say you have a choice between Microsoft and Google and something like Linux, maybe using Windows or Google Chrome or Android, etc., and something that's pure free and open source. Pick the free and open source one if you can. There's one step in technology, in moving towards something, in creating a world that is fairer and more equal. Now, this is a gradient. Free as in freedom, not as in cost. Terrible word in English. Two very, very different meanings. Free as in freedom is much better than open, because open is a very meaningless word today. We've used it a lot for public relations. Open can mean anything from privatization to free labor. And that's better than proprietary, so closed, right? So what do I mean? Again, pragmatically. GPL, AGPL as licenses. If you can use them, use them. Because what you're doing is you're building the commons. And the commons is a very important thing. Without a commons, we get the kind of inequality that we have today. The key thing about a commons is you can't close it off. It's like a field that anyone can access. No one can come and build a fence around it. That's what free licenses give you. Like GPL, Creative Commons share alike. The share alike is very important. Now you don't want to use this, but you can do something open under an MIT license or maybe Creative Commons attribution license, where you just have to say, hey, this person created it and I can use it for any purpose I want. That's good. But it means that, let's say you create an application and you release it under MIT, and I'm Google. I can come and I can say, oh, thank you so much for your work. You know, you're so cool. We love you, dude. We're going to take all of that and we're going to invest $200 million into making it better. But we're sorry, we can't share the stuff that we add with the $200 million to it. But you understand, right? Because you put it under an MIT license. You say, yes, I understand. That's cool. What have they done? They've come and they've built a fence around your field because you said you could. So they're perfectly within their rights to do that. Same with Creative Commons attribution. Whereas here, they couldn't have done that. And of course, then there's proprietary, right? All rights reserved for what you're doing. And there, you're just building private wealth. And you're kind of contributing to the current status. So if you can, here's one way you can contribute. You can contribute to the commons. We need a healthy commons. We don't have one. In the architecture of the things that you build, if you can build something peer-to-peer, decentralized, no middlemen, no Facebook in the middle, if you want to share your photo. Remember that slide? Then do it that way. The cloud is really an altar that we have to stop worshiping at. Build things that are zero knowledge. How can you build what you're building without knowing anything about the people that are using it? Can you? You can. It means that you keep the data here and not here. You keep the data on the devices themselves and not here. And if you can't do that for some part of what you're building, then you can use end-to-end encryption on the bits that you have to have centralized. But this by itself does not fix the problem, just so you know. Facebook implemented end-to-end encryption on WhatsApp. How many of you heard about that? Did you hear at one point that WhatsApp became much more private and Facebook became much more private? Yeah? Because it was in the news, you know, because Moxie Marlinspike, who's a very respected privacy advocate, who built a messaging application called Signal, which is an excellent private messaging application, free and open source as well, which I recommend all of you to use. However, the business model of his company is that he contracts himself out to companies like Facebook and Google to build end-to-end encryption for them, which then becomes great public relations for them because they can say, we're more private now. So everyone bought this when WhatsApp did it. They're like, oh, much more private. Moxie did it. Oh, it's excellent. That's going to be so great. And just this week, if you were watching the news, Facebook is now going to share data with WhatsApp. WhatsApp's going to share data with, of course they are. That's their business model. You know, they didn't change paths. They didn't do anything differently to what they're doing. It was us. We failed to understand this over and over again. So if you're picking a team to work in, don't pick this one. Pick diverse teams to work in. Create diverse teams if you can. Not because it's a charity, but because it's competitive advantage. This is the only way, by having teams that are not all white men like me, this is the only way we're going to solve these problems in a non-colonial way. White men will solve the problems. White men have always solved the problems, right? We have, for ourselves. For ourselves, right? White men solve the problems for themselves. And in a way that, thank you, in a way that benefits them. So if we're going to be non-colonial in the way we design solutions, we have to have diversity in our teams. We can't just have us creating solutions for the other. We have to avoid colonialism. Here's an example of not avoiding colonialism. Mark Zuckerberg, our friend, my friend and yours, and India, right? Mark said to India, hey, Indian people, especially you poor Indian people who can't get on the internet, we care so much about you. We want to give you free internet. But there's a little asterisk. You know, when the white man brings the fire, there's usually an asterisk in terms and conditions. You should read the terms and conditions. The terms and conditions are important. And the terms and conditions said, well, it's not the internet really, it's the Facebook net. And it means that we get to spy on you. And the Indian people, very politely told him that they were not interested, right? Basically what they said was, why should the price of my having less than you do in terms of wealth maybe today mean that I have to put up with your knowing everything about me? Why is that the decision I'm faced with? Not having internet or having you watch everything that I do on your network that you're giving me? That's not a decision that I should have to be faced with. I think there can be better decisions there. And they said no. And Silicon Valley's response, summed up by one of the main venture capitalists, Mark Andreessen, he said, anti-colonialism, beautiful word, has been economically catastrophic for the Indian people for decades. Why stop now? So when I talk about colonialism, when I talk about our approach to designing technologies and not being colonial, this is what I'm talking about avoiding, right? Here's some white guy in Silicon Valley going, anti-colonialism, I mean, that hasn't worked for them. Why should it start now? Now look at this, seriously, because you go to South by Southwest. We go to South by Southwest, right? This institution here goes to South by Southwest. We worship at the altar of Silicon Valley. This is one of your heroes. Does he deserve to be one of your heroes? Look at what he said. Think about it, and think about whether you agree with this. If you are going to work somewhere, ask, what is your business model? How do you make money? You need to know this. There was someone at the conference last week from Google talking about Google VR. And at the end of her talk, I put my hand up and I said, so when Google does VR, when you're having this experience, they're using it as a laboratory. It's a beautiful laboratory because it's complete. They can control every variable and your responses to it. So what do you think about this? And her response was, hey dude, literally, hey dude, I'm just a filmmaker. I don't know. Not acceptable. You work at Google. Your work is being used for this. I just work here has never been an acceptable response. It wasn't an acceptable response in the 1930s. It's not an acceptable response today. So educate yourself on this. Let's say you have to make a decision between Google and Apple. Same? A lot of people would say same, right? Ask that question. What's your business model, Google? Well, we watch what people do, we track what they do, we keep great records of those, we create profiles, we simulate people, we psychologically analyze them, we try to get value from that, we sell that information to others, and we make use of it ourselves to manipulate their behavior, to raise our bottom line. Okay, so Google, when you sell an Android phone, are you happy? No, we're not happy at that point. When do you start becoming happy? We become happy when people start using the Android phone that we sell. Okay. Cool. Apple, you're also a large billion-dollar publicly traded company. How do you make money? We sell products to people. That's how we make our money. Okay. When you sell an iPhone, are you happy? Yes, we're happy. We're even happier if people buy things from iTunes, but they're still buying things, right? So is Google and Apple the same? No. One sells people, one sells products. We have to start being able to differentiate these things. They're both billion-dollar. They're both proprietary in their own ways. And I'm not saying this is the example of what we need going forward. They're not in the commons. But even today, we can make decisions that say either, okay, we're okay with people farming, or we're okay with companies that sell products. I'm much more here right now. I want to be somewhere else where I have a third option. The key thing is, the decisions that you make matter. Every decision. What programming language you learn, which platforms you choose, which technology you buy, which technology you support, which technology you create. I know we're sitting in our little ivory tower here in Malmö and it's all nice and it's a bubble. It's part of the reason why we're here. We love it here. But every decision we make here has ramifications far beyond it. And it's up to us to decide what we feel comfortable with going forward. But let's ask those questions. Because we've come a very far, we've come a very far distance from the days when computers filled up entire rooms. But I think we've also gone very far from when I started out and the magic of having a thing whose only purpose was to make you smarter, was to empower you, and it was working for you. It wasn't working for some corporation. I'd like to we can't get back to this point, but I'd like to go forward to a new point where that is still the case. And I hope that some of you in this room will help us to get to that point. Thank you.